เป็น floor G เป็น FG เป็น floor F C อันนี้คือ F ของพี่ต้น G คือ F เป็นอะไรครับคือเป็น floor G ก็เป็น floor F คือ ของพี่ต้น G คือ channel สูงของตัวเล็กของตัวเล็กของโอเคส่วน H คือ channel หนึ่งก็คือ French เป็น
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being on time. We are about to start, so I would like to invite the speakers to join us and sit on the stage already. And for everyone else to just take your seat, and we're going to start shortly. Okay, I'll give you the floor to the moderator. Frederick Rowski, he's a director of the Asian and Pacific Program for the International Commission of Jurists. Frederick, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to have been asked to host this session on new technologies and new norms, artificial intelligence, privacy protection, cybersecurity, and beyond. We have an impressive panel, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to touch upon and discuss the positive and negative human rights implications of a number of new technologies, from AI to robotics to blockchain to cybersecurity and social media. First, my own introduction. My name is Frederick Rowski. I am the Asia-Pacific Director of the International Commission of Jurists. We are a global organization of judges, lawyers, and human rights defenders working on the full range of human rights issues with a particular focus on strengthening and expanding the global human rights and international law framework. In Asia, we have offices in Bangkok, Yangon, and Kathmandu, with staff based in 7 countries. Looking over some of the framing questions and listening to the conversations and presentations during other parts of the forum, I've noticed an emphasis on opportunities, benefits, innovations, consultation. And although I'm very excited about and committed to the promise of new technologies and the potential for enhancing responsible business, it couldn't help but strike me, as a human rights lawyer, how different that framing is to the day-to-day working experience of human rights lawyers and defenders in the region. Indeed, when we look around the region and the world, we see social dislocation facilitated by automation, social media being used for bullying, harassment, and incitement to violence, the use of new surveillance technologies to target civil society, ethnic and religious minorities, or especially noticeable lately, the extensive use of cybersecurity and telecommunications laws, not so much to regulate technology, but to suppress speech and weaken civil society. So one task I'd like to propose for this session is to examine that gap and see how we can bridge it. Are we in a moment of crisis or opportunity? No doubt both, but to what extent do we share an analysis and an agenda? It is rare to have the human rights community and business community together in the same room, so it is a real opportunity. But I also hope that during the session, we can move beyond the present and look toward the future. Indeed, as human rights lawyers at the ICJ, we often find ourselves in the trenches responding to the emergencies of the day. We don't often take the time to reflect upon the long-term implications of new technologies. They not only have the potential to transform society, we know that they will transform society. The way we work and live, they will bring us together as a global community. They could radically alter governance and even transform our understanding of personal identity or the nature of the human species itself. So it's worth asking ourselves now, looking 10, 20, 30, 100 years into the future, how the current international human rights framework must evolve to deal with these eventualities. We see the post-World War II systems are already feeling the strain of the present political moment. And for instance, the distinction between public and private is starting to seem particularly antiquated, whether we are speaking of public and private identities, spaces, speech, regulatory regimes, or forms of governance. The session is meant to be conversational, so I'll start by giving a very quick introduction to each of our panelists in the beginning. I'd like to welcome Marcus Bartley-Johns, who is the Asia Regional Director for Government Affairs and Public Policy for Microsoft. He works with Microsoft's teams and company stakeholders across the region. Before joining Microsoft, he worked for the World Bank on digital economy and trade issues in Singapore and in Geneva, and he was a lead author of the World Bank's first regional report on the digital economy in Southeast Asia. Christina Schoenleber is Director of Policy and Programs at the Association of Pacific Rim Universities and is responsible for the direction of APRU's policy development in the Asia-Pacific region. And prior to this, Christina was head of knowledge exchange at the Royal College of Art in London, and many other things before that. Elliot Zagman is a tech columnist, podcast host, and a consultant for technology firms. He has spent nearly a decade working with firms in China and elsewhere in Asia. He has written extensively on the nexus of geopolitics, human rights and technology, data privacy and security, AI ethics, and the ramifications of surveillance and AI-based models of business and governance. Jeremy Prepsis is Vice President for Asia Pacific at BSR. Prior to joining BSR in 2006, he spent more than a decade on equipment sourcing, footwear production, and corporate responsibility for Nike. And Sarah Blackwell is the Associate Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, a platform for responsible investment with members based across 4 continents. She is an international human rights lawyer, and prior to joining the Investor Alliance was an advisor at Shift, where she supported companies in implementation of the UN Guiding Principles, and has served as legal and policy coordinator of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable. And there's much, much more to say about every one of the guests, and they'll expand upon their own experience during their remarks. So the format for the panel will be I will ask a couple of broad framing questions for each of the panelists, and they'll speak for about 5 minutes each in response to the question and other issues that they would like to raise. Then we'll have a quick exchange among the panel and hopefully leave as much time as possible for questions and answers, because I think this panel in particular should elicit a lot of interesting responses. So, I will begin by asking Marcus Bartley-Johns from Microsoft, how can we ensure the responsible development and adoption of AI and related new technologies in line with human rights norms? What is Microsoft doing in this regard? And do you have any concerns about the potential misuse of assistance, information, collaborations across these domains?
Sure, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this discussion. I think on this broad topic of new technologies and new norms, I think it is helpful sometimes to ground our discussion in a specific technology like artificial intelligence. And in the same vein, I thought it might be helpful to just spend a minute grounding that discussion in artificial intelligence in what we actually mean, because I think often on this topic we end up going to cinematic and fictional extremes. We have Terminator, we have Skynet, but I think we need to be, it helps to level set a little bit and make sure we're all talking about the same technologies. What we mean by artificial intelligence is really the capacity of computers, of software, over the last 3 years to have the capacity to perform at the same level as humans, human parity in really 4 domains, in terms of vision, the capacity to see and recognize images, in terms of speech, of recognizing words, language, of translating those words from one language into another, and then in terms of knowledge, of actually being able to reason and think through and draw insights from those other domains. So I think what we're talking about here is a very powerful technology, particularly combined with the massive increase in computing power that we've seen through cloud computing in recent years, and then the growth in availability of data. But at the end, what we're talking about is often termed narrow AI rather than general artificial intelligence, or the kinds of examples that maybe jump to mind first. So I think it's very important when we talk about rights, when we talk about ethics, when we talk about responsible AI, to ground that discussion in an understanding of what the technology can and can't do. So having said that, I think, look, I come from a technology company, one that invests a lot in artificial intelligence. We certainly think there are fantastic opportunities through AI to do real social good. We have been working specifically with the human rights community, a partnership that we launched recently with the Clooney Foundation, OHCHR, and other partners that uses artificial intelligence technology to support trial monitors globally. People who are often in some of the most vulnerable human rights situations around the world, to use AI to analyze documents that are captured, to rapidly translate those and make them available to human rights lawyers and monitors around the world. So there are some really positive examples like that of the way in which AI can be used specifically in the domain of human rights. Having said that, of course, we're very aware that this technology comes with challenges and risks as well. And one thing we have been wrestling with and trying to engage as much as possible in public dialogue on is those challenges of AI and how we can get that balance right between the challenges and opportunities. And I think going to one of the questions that Frederick posed at the start about the relevance of the global human rights framework and human rights norms, we think there is a really important role to play here. We're a global company. This technology is global. Ultimately, company by company solutions or approaches, or country by country solutions or approaches, are going to have much less impact than a global approach. And I think it's incredibly important when you're thinking about the global bedrock of norms for responsible use and development of a technology like AI. There is really no better framework than we can turn to than the global human rights legal framework. If we're looking at universality, at least in terms of adoption, unfortunately, if not in terms of observance, but all UN member states, at least they have adopted at least one of the 9 core UN human rights legal instruments. So if we're looking for universality, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various accompanying instruments are one of the best reference points, we think, for us to turn to. particularly if we're looking at articles, principles on non-discrimination, on the right to privacy, on freedoms of expression and association, on the right to share in scientific advancement and the benefits thereof. So we really do have that core reference point that's important. And just to turn specifically then to what we have done at Microsoft and the approach we've been taking informed by those norms, we set out last year a set of 6 principles that are guiding our own development of AI and the way in which we hope to see it adopted by society and companies more broadly. Looking first at fairness, we think it's a core principle that AI should not be used in a way that is discriminatory, and that applies also to the data sets that are fed into the training models for AI. There are huge risks generated if those data sets are based on skewed data, whether it's on ethnic or other grounds, and we've seen already some of the problems that can emerge from that. Reliability and safety is a core principle that we're applying to our AI systems. If we think about technologies like self-driving cars and their use of AI, both of those reliability and safety issues really come to the fore. Privacy, security, this is privacy both in terms of the data that's fed into AI and machine learning models, but also respecting rights to privacy and those private spaces when the technology is used, particularly, and I'll come briefly to the example of facial recognition in a minute. And then to inclusiveness as well, we need to be thinking about extending the benefits of AI to as many people as possible in an inclusive manner. And then 2 bedrock principles of transparency in the way in which AI is used, transparency on the way in which the software has been developed, and then accountability, that there is accountability, there are humans in the loop, that there is a human ultimately who can be held accountable for the use of an AI model. In terms of applying those principles, just briefly, I might mention facial recognition as a really important topic where it's clearly been one of increasing social concern in the previous year or so especially. It's one where mid-last year we started to single this out as a technology where we thought existing legal frameworks were not sufficient to provide the protection of rights, essentially, that we would all want to see. So we've called in the US, in other countries, for there to be facial recognition, specific regulation developed. We think it's something that companies like ourselves can move forwards on. We've been trying to develop partnerships with the technology industry and others more widely on the responsible use of facial recognition. We've tried to reflect those 6 principles that I spoke about in our own development and deployment of facial recognition systems. But ultimately, because of the global and frankly porous nature of technologies like this, we think it's one where there is going to need to be regulation and a role for governments. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to let the rest of the panel have a few words. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So many interesting questions to begin the conversation. I can see this playing out on a number of different levels. One is that technical level, the regulatory level. What kind of legislation can effectively address human rights concerns around facial recognition? Is it even possible to effectively address them at the national level, or are there only global solutions to these problems? And then there's the larger normative question, which is that development of these technologies, it seems to me, requires a conversation about norms and ethics and global human rights standards, and we'll get into that a little bit more and a bit of an assessment as to whether the existing frameworks that we have are up to the task. I'd like to turn to Christina now. Christina, if you could tell us a bit about what the Association of Pacific Rim Universities is doing around AI, and tell us what are some of the challenges and risks, what policy innovations are you seeing in this space, and where do you see the main gaps in terms of governance and norms relating to AI in the context of the work that you're doing?
Thank you very much. So first of all, I hope you're all awake after lunch. And it's a real honor to be here when I was asked to join this panel. It's going to be an interesting discussion here. So I represent the APU, the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. We are a network of 50 universities across the Asia Pacific, so very much focused on this region. And the description of what I do is not, I don't develop our policies, but what I do is I work with our academic experts across our member institutions, across 17 economies across this region, to initiate new thinking based on the research that they do to support policymakers in coming up with public policies that address some of the key issues of challenges of the region. And that's very broad. So we work on things like population aging, global health, the Pacific Ocean, but digital economy is a key area that we've worked on now since 2013. So we've initially for a number of years brought together stakeholders, all our key academic experts across the region, from China, from Japan, from Southeast Asia, from Hong Kong. We brought together industry and policymakers for a number of years to really discuss and get to know each other. What are the issues? And over the last 3 years, we started developing specific projects. And they were funded kindly by industry, and they give us money, and then that allows us to bring academics together and thinkers. And we now started working also on a true cross-border collaboration with UNESCAP on this. So we see ourselves as a neutral platform. That means we can actually get the people in a room and think about this, and then come up with recommendations that also the cross-border stakeholders can draw on. So it's mainly policymakers, but also for industry to draw on some of these insights, really. So you ask about some of the challenges. Well, we 2 years ago started a project. We called it AI for Everyone. And it was really about looking not at the technology per se, but looking at how AI really affects society, and looking at some of the opportunities clearly that the technology offers, but then really specifically also looking at some of the fears and challenges that civil society has about this technology, and come up with thinking of how this could be addressed. So just to give you some of these, and you will have heard about this already, and you've also addressed some of these already, but there's, and I have to say, these were 12 academics completely, so some of these were computer scientists, we had philosophers in the room. It was a cross-forward, multidisciplinary group of people that really thought about these. So one of these challenges was really about the black box, that AI acts as a black box, and ultimately society will be manipulated. And we were talking about how this could be addressed. I mean, clearly one is about reducing the perception of this, increasing the understanding of the technology in general, but also should there be an implementation of a framework to certificate systems of trustworthy AI? Will that help, for example, to limit these fears? The next one was about unethical use of AI, and you may remember about a year ago now there was this really big debate about autonomous weapons and killer robots, and interestingly enough that was initiated by one of our members in Korea, one of our university members in Korea, setting up an institution, and then the initiator of this debate was another one of our academics in another member institution, a different economy, saying this is really, that something needs to be done about this. And really, that debate fed into our project very well. And we really had a big conversation about what it means. What's really, do we need to redefine this responsibility of moral agent, and who is a moral agent in this respect of a robot, and when it comes to weapons, for example. Another big concern, I mean, these are all big concerns, I have to say, but is threat on privacy. And what happens in terms of, AI technology is amazing. It learns pattern, it recognizes data, it predicts attitudes. So what does that mean in terms of all the data out there through social media? And we've had the big debates about that elections can be influenced through all of this knowledge, and so how do we deal with this? And that's also then exploring tensions between the individual and the collective benefits of managing data in general. And then I think the last really big fear that was discovered there, or that was talked about, and is really very pertinent for this panel, I think was about the gap, that AI will widen the gap between the rich and the poor, which I don't think is talked about enough. We know that the impact of AI technology and disruptive technologies in general will be very different when it comes to developed or developing economies, when it comes to industries, and maybe some of the solutions in terms of upskilling and reskilling workforce and coming workforce, maybe this, ideas are the same across, but the implementation of this is very different. So there is a thinking about this that needs to be addressed, and we really looking to academic input in terms of working with policymakers on this. And really quickly, you ask about some of the innovation. That's the latest project that we're doing now, and that's in collaboration with UNESCAP and also, again, funded by industry. And we had the kickoff meeting there last week, which is really, so we're just starting on this, and just 3 thoughts on this. So we had one project that was talking about really who should drive policy development now in terms of technology? Is it the people that are doing the policy development now, are these the right people? Do they have enough knowledge about technology? Or should it be really technologists doing the policy? It's a big debate. I think it was quite controversial, but it's an interesting thought. So we'll have a year to think about these and come up with some ideas and recommendations on this. Another one was really about the data is the currency of AI and of AI technologies and machine learning in terms of algorithm. You just mentioned, you touched on data. It's a big topic, clearly. But is it really desirable that there's a limited number of corporations and a limited number of economies that have significant power through the collection of data? And how should this be addressed? And then a third one was that was linking to the keynote panel this morning, really, in terms of trade, sustainable trade. And there was really thinking about this, that AI can help maybe some weaker or more developing economies to gain and gather knowledge, more in-depth knowledge in terms of understanding how they can develop their domestic markets, so they get a parity in terms of power with other stakeholders where they need to trade, for example. So that's another interesting thought. So this project is not blue sky thinking. It's really about getting academics to think about what can be done in terms of these challenges and how can they be addressed.
Thank you very much. Again, so much there to talk about. Just in the interest of trying to connect things up to the broader human rights discussion, I think the question of changing nature of what you called a moral agent is interesting. As warfare becomes more and more algorithmic and destructive technologies become more and more attenuated from decision makers, it's worth asking whether our international criminal and humanitarian law frameworks also need to do a better job of thinking through those problems and addressing them. And the question of inequality, the concentration of power, data as a new currency, again, looking across international law frameworks, including frameworks around economic, social, and cultural rights, wealth inequality, it's worth having a conversation about that as well. I'm going to turn to Elliot Zagman. The original framing question for Elliot was about the risks of data being used for unintended purposes, but he rightly pointed out, well, we ought to start the conversation by asking what are the risks of it being used for its intended purposes. And I think it's worth thinking through and mapping out the various and complex incentives across the public, private sector, and elsewhere around the use of data and other new technologies. But I'll leave that to Elliot.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here, by the way. Working in technology for tech companies and being a writer and podcast host, usually when I go to these kind of events, I don't get an opportunity to wear a suit very often. Usually it's, do I have to wear a collar? Is that how that is? Can I wear a hoodie? But yeah, I guess it's the UN, so it's a different ballgame. But yeah, I think that the big question here, oftentimes it is this idea of unintended consequences, or this term unintended consequences is brought up. But the bigger question here is who's making the intention? What is their intention? And what if they overintend? right? And I think that is a question that, that hasn't been as important in the past as it is now, although it certainly has been important in the past. So if we look at the intenders, who are the intenders and what do they intend? Well, we have large technology companies, right? We have Google, we have Facebook, we have Alibaba, et cetera, et cetera. What do they intend? What is their intention? Well, as much as our friend from Microsoft here is, obviously they want to create a rights framework for their long-term benefit, but the way that corporations are set up, their number one intention is to benefit their shareholders, right? That is how businesses work. There's nothing wrong with that, but that is their intention, right? And now they have more power to do that than they have before. When it comes to governments, political parties, regimes, especially if they're more authoritarian, as at least half of the world is, their intention is to remain in power or to ensure stability, often as they define it, right? So that is a thorny topic as well. And then we also have the idea of the rights of the individual. We have democracy, we have civil society. Right? So we have all these different intentions that I think we need to look at first and foremost, because those intentions will decide how this technology gets used. And what we see, at least from the way that the direction that things are going, is that as Christina mentioned, the power holders here, which is mostly either political entities or corporations, are centralizing their power in a way that is growing exponentially, and ways in which what was before simply a logistical issue now becomes an issue where rights need to be taken into consideration. So I'll give you an example. In the past, an advertiser had just limits because they didn't know what you or I or he or she or whatever was thinking, right? They didn't know your psychology, they didn't know your background, they didn't know your experience, they didn't know exactly how to target an ad. Now they do. Right, so the agency of the individual that before was just given by kind of the limited scale that the advertiser has, now that's gone, right? So you'll see that in many cases, as Yuval Noah Harari says, we're getting to a point where an advertiser or an AI or an authority figure, et cetera, will know you better than you know yourself. Right, and in this case, this idea of this liberal idea of individual rights gets a lot murkier, doesn't it? When it comes to governments or regimes that are in power, for many of them, the folk, I think in the West we talk a lot about the idea of, we talk a lot about rights, because often we can talk about rights because our governments are more established and our systems are more competent. For much of the world, it really has been an issue of regimes and governments trying to ensure stability. So I focus on China a lot. For the last few hundred years, that's really what they've been trying to do, is just try to avoid chaos. If you look at what's happened in Chinese history, the kind of worst moments in Chinese history have been moments of chaos, not from government overreach as much. But that's arguable, I guess. But at least that's the way that many Chinese would see it. But in China, they had this saying where they would say "Tian Gao Huangdi Yuan," which is basically that the mountains are high or the sky is high and the emperor is far away. So there was this idea that because the empire was so vast that the emperor could not govern the tiny details of everyone's individual and local lives. So just by the nature of bureaucracy and the nature of logistics, there was kind of a source of kind of a personal space or personal rights that were often, or self-governance that were given. Now what we're seeing, not just in the case of China, but in many other places as well, is that kind of middle layer of bureaucracy kind of gets swept out of the way. So the emperor isn't so far anymore, right? Whether that emperor is a political leader or a large corporate entity. So right now, before the logistics of the situation and the bureaucracy limited the ability of the authority figures, so that rights wasn't always something that had to be on the forefront. Now it's unavoidable. So whether you're an entity, or whether you're a corporate entity, whether you're a government, it has to be something that is embedded within your decision making. And if it isn't, it is something that I think is going to take us into a place that I think many people would be concerned about.
Thank you. Thank you, Elliot. Once again, a lot to consider and think about. Particularly interesting, this question as to whether attributing rights and attributing agency to people, and then seeking ways to protect that space to exercise that agency is any longer sufficient, and that there isn't perhaps an entire other level of consideration we now have to give when we're thinking about what constitutes the integrity of a person, or human dignity and personality. Interesting topic I think we can take up further. I'll turn now to Jeremy. Jeremy, can you tell us a bit about the work that BSR has done with tech firms, including social media companies at the global level and in Asia? Based on your experience, what are some of the potential negative impacts of new technologies? And in your view, what is the proper role of the private sector in helping to develop human rights norms and frameworks?
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and participate in this discussion. And it's very interesting. I think my experience comes at it from a slightly different perspective, right? I come from an experiential perspective of rights not being protected, right? Trying to figure out which rights are supposed to be protected by whom and when, sometimes in challenging governance situations. And how have we worked in that direction? And just in some ways, I've been working on responsible business since 1999, when, in that question of discovery of rights, I worked for Nike as the labor practice manager sitting in Vietnam and Cambodia. And this whole question of globalization, and is that a sweatshop, or is that an employment opportunity? And what are the rights of that worker in that situation? And where is freedom of association? And how does gender come into play here? And what about occupational injuries? And all those questions, and going through and exploring those from the very, very beginning, right? And there's always been, in my mind at least, this interesting tension in human rights between humans and rights, and putting those together, and how does that play out? And what is the role of business, which is where BSR works in this space? And since the early 90s, or late 90s, at BSR, which is a business membership association, a not-for-profit, mission-driven organization that works to create a more just and sustainable world, we've had a chance to explore some of these ideas. And whether it's in Papua New Guinea and the highlands with the Lankos, or whether it's focusing on free prior informed consent with farmers in Laos, or whether you're looking at some of the questions on IFC performance standards, and how does that affect a large energy company in Indonesia and its access to finance, and then increasingly lots of human rights impact assessments, and working with companies, all kinds of companies, on these issues. And what's really interesting is globalization is this movement or trend that is affecting business all over the world. And AI is a general purpose technology, right? So you should think of this as the question of, this is the steam engine for this next 100, 200 years. It's going to change everything. And when steam engines came into play, when electricity came into play, everything over time changed. And everything, I think, will change with this. But as we're looking back and sitting in this room in particular, I think over the last 15, 20 years, we've learned something really important that I think absolutely applies to AI, absolutely applies to companies and tech companies, and not just tech companies. And to play to the audience here, but this is what BSR believes, is human rights-based methodologies, what we've learned for this last 15, 20, 30 years of responsible business development, methodologies, they offer a robust framework, right, for responsible development and use of AI. and should be an essential part of how business develops and promotes AI. Right? And that means the core of that, a lot of this is around stakeholder engagement. A lot of this is around listening to those and those who will be most affected, who are most at risk, thinking about your usage of technology. And that kind of leads to the second bit. When we're talking about AI, it's actually not just about Microsoft or Google or others. Every industry, if you have retail, AI will be affecting you. If you're in logistics and transportation, AI will be affecting you. If you're in healthcare, AI will be affecting you. You have a responsibility to know and understand that technology because it's your customer who walks into that store, right? And the third one, and this is maybe the challenge for us in this room, and I'd love to unpack and talk about this, is we need to continue to innovate, right? We need to be able to engage employees. It's not just engineering, it's the marketing and sales strategy, it's your KYC strategies, it's thinking about those who will be using your technology. What are the intended, right, and unintended consequences? How do we think about seeing around the corner? Because I think one of the things we've learned in the last 15 or 20 years, this question of, oh, we didn't know? Well, modern due diligence actually says you should be thinking about that now. Right? So how do we engage? So innovative methods for human rights due diligence need to uncover blind spots, imagine unintended consequences, and anticipate what we all believe, I think, is a highly uncertain future. So happy to explore more on that. That's what this panel's interested for. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jeremy. We're getting more and more practical now in the conversations. It's interesting to hear about the utility of a human rights-based methodology, or what we might call human rights-based due diligence, is itself a technical, legal, ethical question worth exploring in some of this particular context. And I'm going to turn to Sarah now, who will continue on from that point and talk about some of the initiatives she's been involved with. And I'll ask her, how can investors and the broader business community better collaborate with civil society actors to build understanding of new technologies, real and potential impacts on people, and coordinate meaningful action in response?
Great, thanks, Frederick. And so thanks so much to the organizers for including us on this really interesting panel. So just a little briefer on the initiative that I'm a part of, because it's relatively new. We're about a year in the making. Again, we're called the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and we are a coalition of institutional investors, so from asset managers, asset owners, to public pension funds, endowments, trade union funds, private wealth, the whole big tent of institutional investors that are aiming to drive their practice in a more forward-looking way on human rights. And throughout all of the initiatives that we work on with our membership is partnerships with civil society organizations. And right now we're comprised of 3.5 trillion assets under management as part of our membership. So, so a growing voice, I think, reflected there in the investor community. Before I sort of get into what we're doing around these issues, particularly looking at the ICT sector as a priority industry for investors to consider human rights impacts in their portfolios around, just wanted to sort of pause, and maybe it goes without saying, but I think it's worth saying, that a lot of the human rights impacts that we're sort of alluding to and referencing already as part of this discussion aren't necessarily in the future. They're right now. And human rights defenders on a day-to-day basis are feeling the impacts of new technologies and the lack of new norms to regulate those technologies in a way that respect human rights every day. These technologies are being used to surveil, target, harass, discriminate against individuals and societies around the world. So just wanted to sort of make sure we stop and reflect on that. This isn't just something of the future, it's a real experience that people are having every day. And as we're sitting here in Tunisia, there's an extremely large conference that includes a lot of directly impacted rights holders speaking, and there's spaces being made to give their voice amplification around these issues. It's called RightsCon, organized by Access Now, which is a leading digital rights organization that works directly with these types of human rights defenders. And I would just say, a plug to a good friend organization, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, who has very clear documentation of these types of impacts on human rights defenders every day. So I'd encourage you to go there. So what's the role for investors in this arena? So as I alluded to, our membership is prioritizing the ICT sector, particularly because of this urgency of these issues. And with that, we have, at the demand of our membership, aimed to put together a number of different tools and partnerships for institutional investors to engage with the plethora of rights that are threatened by the sector. We have put together, for investors, I think this question of human rights due diligence, what does that look like? For investors, who have a broad range of sectors and companies, geographies that are reflected in their portfolios, where do you get started and how do you prioritize? So we're aiming to equip our members with sector-wide impact assessments that are pulling out key salient human rights issues in the ICT sector, so including around freedom of opinion and expression, privacy and data protection, security and conflict, and aiming to get to the work and say, if the ICT sector is in your portfolio, chances are these are salient issues for you. Here's what other investors are doing in this space. Here are key questions that you can ask the companies that you're invested in, and using not only your leverage, but engaging with your responsibility under things like the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. But for investors, they need data, right? They need numbers to sort of back up their investment decisions, and so we're also aiming to connect them with a number of human rights benchmarks and scoring mechanism, indicators, metrics that are already well developed in this space and are continuously evolving. So in this particular arena, the Ranking Digital Rights Index is a really instrumental tool for investors and really the whole business and human rights community. Many civil society organizations also use this in their campaigns around ICT issues. And it demonstrates that there's a far road ahead. There was a very recent updating of the Ranking Digital Rights Index, and I think it's 24 companies that are now being scored. Microsoft is at the top, but that being said, Microsoft and its top peers, the leaders in the index, are still at 60% score and lower. We all went to school. That's pretty failing grade still. So there's a lot of work still to be done. And also, I'll just sort of wrap up by saying investor action. There's a lot going on in this arena. I'm wanting to sort of pull the discussion maybe here and hear from the room about specific actions and tools that are being used. There are a number of investor shareholder resolutions that this shareholder season have been put forth. Our membership led the charge on 2 particular resolutions at Amazon that were recently voted on at the AGM a couple of weeks ago. And both of these look at recognition with a K. That's their facial recognition technology that is being associated with potential sale to immigration and enforcement, customs division within the United States, high risk of racial profiling and threats to immigrant rights. And so our membership and investors are asking for human rights impact assessments to be done of that technology before sale to governments happen. And there was, a pushback from Amazon on those resolutions, and they were in fact upheld by the SEC for a vote. So I think it's indicating some promising new terrain in terms of new norms and expectations from the government as well. And I think just to sort of wrap up here, going back to my initial point, just the need to sort of humanize these issues. And that's something that at the Investor Alliance we're always trying to do for our membership. It's hard for multinational companies to engage with not shareholders, stakeholders. I'm mixing that up a lot these days. Stakeholders and affected rights holders themselves on a day-to-day basis, engaging with international organizations who can make those connections, provide sort of a proxy understanding of different issues is key. But for investors, there's many additional layers that are involved. So we're trying to play that role. And recently, this past month, we, with our membership, arranged secure calls where they could hear directly from a number of impacted individuals and organizations in the MENA region, Europe, Latin America, Africa, and this type of multi-stakeholder engagement and involvement and making of space for those that are most impacted, I think is really critical and something we're trying to support. So I'm really looking forward to, especially those of you in the room, if you have insights on that in particular. But thanks for having us as part of the discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for bringing us back to the ground and reminding us that these technologies or aspects of them have immediate and very consequential impacts on people's lives, particularly people who are working on human rights, including human rights defenders, whether it's facial recognition technology that facilitates racial profiling in the United States, or fake news laws that completely seek to collapse the distinction between public and private when it comes to digital communication and technology. Or we see in Hong Kong this week people fearful to ride the metro because of being tracked, their movements being tracked and being associated with ongoing protests and its consequences. Before turning over to the audience, I'll just take us quickly back to the title of the session, which is New Technologies and New Norms. And I just wonder if any of the panelists would like to add more to this question of norms. Are we in a truly fundamental transitional period now where the normative framework under which we live, our ideas about self, about community, about governance need to fundamentally change? Or is it something less than that? And in your view, does the current human rights framework and broader international framework provide enough, or at least the right starting point for thinking about these issues?
I think when it comes to norms, I think I'm not the first person to talk about this, but I think one of these, this is a key point in history right now, because I think we are definitely seeing kind of a bifurcation or a balkanization between the US-led internet and technology space and the Chinese-led internet and technology space. And those are going to be governed by two very, very, very different norms. And if they remain working with each other, I think that there is a far greater chance that that either one of them is not led to their worst extremes. I'd say my biggest concern when it comes to norms is that by separating these two, you kind of leave them each to their own, vulnerable to their worst excesses. So one thing that I'm following is looking at how those norms are being differentiated and kind of moving away from each other, and how kind of these different concepts of rights or concepts of the individual, concepts of privacy or democracy or whatnot are informing these norms.
Maybe to build on that a little bit, whose norms where and when? And when are they applied? And is this part of your technology creation process? Is this part of your sales process? Is this part of how you're going to market with this? Of course, there's the technology side behind it, which, to be honest, I know nothing about, right? But we've gone through this in a lot of ways, and it's part of the conversation that's been in this room sometimes today, which is the norms of the buyer, the norms of the supplier, right? The norms of the worker, right? What is the life that they are living? How do we bring those things into the conversation? And so I think all of this is going to be reconnected and reworked on. And the question of stability versus openness, there's always balancing to that, and there's differences in different countries at different points in time. And I think the larger question of one technology, one norm, Silicon Valley will liberate the world. I'm not quite sure it works exactly that way.
Steal the moderator's microphone, then you have control of the discussion. No, not at all. I think maybe I'm misunderstanding, and I have to confess I'm not a human rights lawyer or human rights expert, so I look at this from the perspective of someone who works on technology policy and governance issues. But I think the challenge in saying that norms are specific to specific contexts, or that the norms we have today are suddenly irrelevant, is that leaves a huge vacuum. And I think as we've heard from the point from a number of panelists, and I think as we all know from reading the news and our own personal experience, there are big opportunities presented by a lot of the technologies we have today, like artificial intelligence, but there are also huge challenges that come with them. And without a set of fundamental principles or norms to guide the decisions that companies, that governments, that society makes about the use of those technologies, I think we have a huge risk. And that's where I think when I look at our principles governing the development and adoption of artificial intelligence systems, I do see a lot of commonality, and this is part of the explicit thinking in Microsoft, is that the international human rights norms that have existed for quite some time continue to be highly relevant. And we do need global reference points, global norms, when we think about the development and application of that technology. Now, that's not to say that things aren't going to change. Some laws are going to have to change, some regulations are going to have to change. There will be some of these fundamental questions about agency in artificial intelligence systems, but we have to work with what we have today, and we need to be making decisions about the deployment, the development of technologies today, and that's where I think those norms continue to be such a fundamentally important reference point.
I'd like to add something. I agree, we need norms. I think what I'd like to throw into the room is that I think we're only at the beginning of this journey. We all know that technology will continue to develop exponentially much faster than it has over the last 5-10 years, and I don't think we can yet imagine where we're going to get to with this 10-15 years. I know we need to imagine, but we don't know, so we may well have to rethink some of the norms and some of the frameworks.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then also to recognize some of the normative frameworks and developments that perhaps we can build on and observe and support. So just to link this to the conversations around human rights due diligence, obviously responsible business conduct due diligence, the great guidance that the OECD and others are leading on. But the fact that mandatory human rights due diligence is a fast developing reality in many different jurisdictions. We have the duty of vigilance law in France, obviously around modern slavery, a number of mandatory initiatives around reporting, sort of trying to drive mandatory human rights due diligence within companies. At this stage, as far as I'm aware, there's not sort of tech-specific initiatives in that regard, but looking more broadly at what is out there, what's being done to drive better business respect for human rights, responsible business conduct, and support those so that we do have a foundation for those future adaptations as well.
And I think in that space then, building on UN guiding principles, building on the ILO core conventions, those things that have been built into our normative framework, or is it practical framework, wherever we end up going, right? The real question then is, how do we educate? How do we include? How do we talk to government? Because traditionally, these are emerging issues, at least in my view. Government always, and for good reason, supposed to be behind the curve sometimes on trying to understand and work on these issues. And that's where this kind of a convening, but even more deeper into this, and this is the work that Microsoft and others are doing, of trying to educate and engage not just government, but civil society and other rights and stakeholders in this space. And that's very interesting.
Thank you. And of course, it's reassuring to hear that we all have a commitment to these the body of international law and standards that exists. Of course, with the ICJ, we always start with UDHR, the covenants, the guiding principles, the ILO conventions, and it's indeed one of the guiding principles of this event we have here. I don't want to steal any more time from the audience, and the panel has been very disciplined. So we've got a full 30 minutes, I think, for questions. I'm sorry. Oops, we've got a full 15 minutes. So I think what we'll do is I'll take maybe 3 questions at a time, and then we'll do. I was right. Yes. Okay. I think we'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and maybe do 2 or 3 rounds of questions. Let me try and be equitable about it. Maybe I'll take one from each section of the room. Would you like to begin?
Yes, Dante Pesce from the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. A question following on the comment on governments. And we're having our forum around policy coherence and leading by example. So I wonder what is the appetite that you have seen in the host countries of the main technological companies, and how eager they are to self-regulate or to regulate their own sector, let's say, example, the US or China. Because if those governments are not on board positively and restricting on the negative side of technology, this conversation is useless, because that's going to happen anyway, and the negative side is going to prevail pretty much. So how can we get them on board, and do you see any hope there, or any, let's say, lights coming from those 2 particular governments, but it can be any other government where the technology companies are actually headquartered or operating? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a question from the gentleman in the back there.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the great comments from the panel. Mac Darrow from the UN Human Rights Office. My first question picks up on the last round of comments, and I'm thinking of the state's duty to protect in this context. And I wonder if the panelists could talk a tiny bit more about what they think are the possibilities as well as frontiers of state responses, regulatory responses, and how that connects with the idea of remedy as well in this context. Congressman Ro Khanna, who's pushing this, the Internet Bill of Rights in the United States, has commented recently on the frustrations he's encountered with the lack of knowledge of legislators in the US on these issues. And so obviously some deep challenges there. And what are the alternatives? Is there innovative thinking, multi-stakeholder arrangements and what have you, bearing in mind again the question of remedy? And a tiny question on a big subject, video manipulation is another technology, of course, where human rights defenders will really be increasingly feeling the strain. But also in the our entire politics and ruptures within our societies are very much on the line if this technology is indeed, it becomes more sophisticated and abused more widely. Could you comment on that technology?
Can I take one question from this side of the room?
Hello, my name's Adam Dubas. I'm the New Zealand National Contact Point under the multinational guidelines. My question is in relation to, in March, New Zealand experienced a terrorist attack against our Muslim community that was quite profoundly affecting in our country. The attack was live streamed, went viral, and it remains online. The Christchurch call came out of that horrible event, and it was a commitment by governments and tech companies to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. In this, I gratefully acknowledge Microsoft's work in this area and is one of the partners in this call. My question is in relation to the discussion about standards and norms and some of the other points that were raised. Who makes these standards and norms, and who enforces them? I mean, is there enforcement mechanisms that we can rely on for human rights defenders or other people who suffer the harm from these new technologies? And also, to what degree are online service providers and tech companies responsible for when their platforms and products cause harm? Thank you.
I'll allow the panel to respond to those questions.
Thank you. I'd go to the, I think, second question in terms of lack of knowledge of legislators, which so nicely ties into one of the discussions that we had last week in terms of getting our academic colleagues together and also policymakers and industry to talk about what needs to happen in terms of policy development and enabling environments for AI for social good. And it was from one of our colleagues from Hong Kong, actually, and I've got the paper here, and they really argued that, as I mentioned before briefly, that scientific understanding on artificial intelligence is really important in terms of implication for AI policy development or development in terms of technologies that are disruptive. And it was very interesting to see the debate in the room, because I think there's a big divide in terms of some of the region or some of the economies within the regions, and also some of the opinions of where this will lead. But I mean, we all know that there's the need to have knowledge of the technologies to be able to regulate them and to put policies in place. And I think it's about thinking how they can catch up, how you can actually provide this knowledge, teach this knowledge, but also it's about understanding the impact of not just the technology itself, how it works, but also the impact it has on society. And I would dare to say that this will be implemented in different ways for different economies and even different regions. We didn't come up with a solution for this. Maybe in a year's time we might have some ideas, but it's very interesting. It was very interesting to see last week the different opinions in the room, and if you were to put it on ice and said, okay, let's look at this again and pull this up again. There's a big debate, I think, that's going on at the moment.
Thanks very much. So really interesting questions. I mean, maybe to try and tackle the two questions about regulation together, because I think that they're related. This idea of some jurisdictions that will move slowly but are very important is certainly a challenge that we've faced. In the United States, we've been calling for a federal privacy law for 15 years, and it hasn't happened yet. I think there'll be calls for regulation on some of these technologies from companies, from society more widely, for longer than people would like there to be an absence of those regulations. So I think the challenge there is, what do you do in the interim? I think multi-stakeholder approaches do have a really important role to play, and I think we've seen that in the international space in some important areas. I think the Christchurch call is one recent example. I think the Paris call last year, which now has, I think, 66 governments, hundreds of companies, about 100 organisations have joined as well in a multi-stakeholder approach to developing norms for acceptable state conduct in cyberspace, an area that I think is far off in terms of an actual international treaty, but there's a recognition that there has to be movement in the meantime. So I think those sorts of approaches can really yield some progress in the short term. I think the other thing is to start with some of the doable bits of regulation. So when we talk about facial recognition regulation, some of the specifics we've talked about are, well, why not regulate a requirement for companies that are developing AI systems to provide transparent documentation, both technical and non-technical, that explains the data that was fed in, the basis of the training model, and some of the perhaps risks that are associated with that. That's something that should be doable to be passed in many different jurisdictions. So I think you can sort of slice it in different ways and try to move ahead where it's possible, while also looking at some of the multi-stakeholder approaches. Let me pass it on to others, though. Thanks.
Right here. So a few different questions there. First of all, when it comes to the gentleman from New Zealand about the role that I believe that the platforms play in kind of trying to govern themselves and ensuring that things like the Christchurch shooting, aren't encouraged. I think a lot of this goes back to incentives. And when we talk about, the intended consequences, I think YouTube's a great example where you have, I think we're seeing more and more, if you look at YouTube's user base and their amount of the revenue that they've been bringing in over the last couple of years, it's skyrocketed, especially in comparison with a lot of these other platforms. And one of the big reasons for that is their recommendation algorithm. And one thing that they do to keep people on is that they send people further and further and further into often extremist rabbit holes. Now, what do you do about that? Do you tell Google, okay, you can't use that recommendation algorithm for YouTube? Do you break up the tech companies? I think that breaking up the tech companies probably is a solution that I think may have a lot of use for, or maybe could potentially be quite effective. But yeah, I think it's not a solution with an easy answer. And I think that when we look at something like this idea of extremism, right? So how to counter extremism online. I think then we have the other side of that, which is how do you define extremism? And because every time that you say, okay, we need to go after extremists, one person's extremist is another person's peaceful protester, as we're seeing if we watch the news. So to me, this all comes back down to what can you not do to someone else simply because you have power over them? I mean, simply, like, the world, like our governments don't agree on this, even a baseline. So until you can get this core agreement that just because you have power over someone else, you can't do this. I get very nervous about anything that is done to try to control online activity or to try to use AI for policing or for governance.
Anyone else? I mean, from the ICJ perspective, I feel that international law has most of the tools that we need to address these issues. They just need to be extended and better operationalized. Principles such as the duty to protect, the right to a remedy. I think we just need to do a better job of applying these and working out the intricacies of enforcing them in a world where public and private spaces are no longer easy to distinguish. I know in many of the countries where we work, I mean, Facebook is the public square. And in many cases, it's the primary or the only place where political speech takes place. It's also the place where most hate speech, discrimination, and violence is generated, exacerbated in various ways. It's not the cause of conflict in every case, but we're making efforts. I think there are efforts being made on the public side, on the private side, around discussions of international law. But indeed, I think those fundamental normative ideas and principles are there, still embedded in the international framework that we have. I'm going to take another round of questions. I'll do the same thing for this woman back here in the left.
I'm Doina Gimic from UNDP. I also have a brief question around regulation and contextualized approaches versus universal global approaches, unified global approaches. We have been speaking for a while now of regulatory impact assessment, gender impact assessment, environmental impact assessment, human rights impact assessment. Very recently, Canada came out with an algorithmic impact assessment. I wonder if any of the panelists is familiar with the tool, and what do you think that the level of buy-in from other governments would be, and how the AI developers community and corporations sees it? Thank you.
Sir, up front.
Hi, my name's David Marcus. I work as the head of privacy at State Street. My question is also about this issue of norms, because on the one hand, we're talking about legal norms, which are quite robust in the jurisdiction we're talking about. But in terms of soft law instruments, there's a number of guidance frameworks, starting, I would say, from the OECD privacy guidelines in the 80s, which I guess have been the most useful in the area of privacy. My question is more framed as a comment that artificial intelligence is, in a way, an opportunity for companies to act as processors and controllers of data. And if we look at it from that perspective, it would be pertinent to understand that the privacy and data protection standards and standardization of those standards would be perhaps the best starting point for allowing for guidance in this area. So touching on the OECD report recently on regulatory divergence, where they indicated that it costs companies up to 15% of annual profits, I'm wondering how we can address this issue of standardization and who the best actor in the field would be.
Can I take another question from this side of the room? This woman in the center.
Hi there, my name is Sophia. I work for Varus Maplecroft. We're a risk consultancy firm. I had a question about it's kind of in the early stages right now, the social credit system in China. And I think in particular, maybe Elliot Zegman might be able to provide some insight on this. But essentially what it is a mass surveillance systems of sort, right? I mean, there have been a lot of doomsday scenarios about the social credit system being something mirroring, Black Mirror, where if you, for example, if you don't pay your, fines for your, I don't know, any fines for, driving or whatever, then you might not be allowed to buy plane tickets. So obviously we can see the human rights implications of that. So what I'd like to understand is this something that is on the radar of civil society, organizations and businesses? Is this something that people are talking and thinking about? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to the panel again, and I think if we're concise, we can fit in one more round of questions after that.
I'll just answer the question about the social credit system. I think that's a really complicated question at this point. Because you have different ways that they've tested out different social credit systems on different kind of local levels. Plus, there's this idea where it's more to be thought of as something like a social credit culture. So every platform has their own form of kind of credit. And a lot of it is just, do you pay your bills? Do you behave with respect to other people on this, on this Q&A platform and things like that. So I think in some of the reporting has taken it a little beyond kind of where it is right now. However, it is at the very beginning stages. And once again, you get back to this idea of, what's the rights foundation there? What are the principles around it that ensures that it doesn't get out of control, right? What are the boundaries that within which it operates? And that's a question that I don't really have an answer for, and I often wonder about. But some of it, if you look at it from the Chinese context, like is very sorely needed. Like they haven't had, like in the U.S., this the kind of credit scores that we have in order to get a loan or something like that. So one big problem in China is that people borrow money from people and they don't pay it back. And they've had this thing called basically the debtor's blacklist, where people who are not good, do not behave well financially, and getting put on a blacklist. And I think that most Chinese people that I speak to really think that this is a good idea, because a lot of them have been screwed over by people who owe them money, right? So I think that the broader idea of the social credit system really worries me if there isn't another idea or principle behind it that isn't just whatever keeps the people in power. Because if that's the only logic that they're using, it's something that really scares me. But I do think that there are a lot of it should be studied, and there are probably a lot of very useful lessons that will be learned and ways that it could be applied in a positive way.
Going down a slightly different road. The question of norms and the foundation, how do you work through some of these challenges? And there was an issue 7 or 8 years ago that had to do with disclosure of email data that got an activist arrested, and then a discussion after that between, on one side, Amnesty, and on the other side it was Google and Yahoo and others, right? And this discussion about, well, when law enforcement asks for information, there's a right to privacy, but there's also a law enforcement question. And what are the processes that need to happen? What are legitimate foundational requests that a company should be responding to, right? And which are not? How many of those requests are happening, and where do they happen? And at the end of that discussion, and I'm blanking on the acronym as usual, there was a creation of a not-for-profit organization that sits in between that, right? And that was created by actually the Berkman Center at Harvard, and BSR was part of the creation thereof. Microsoft reports on a yearly basis, as do GNI, yes, Global Network Initiative, right? And reports on those issues. And that's an example of sometimes how some of these issues then result in business and human rights dialogue and the creation of a process thereafter, which was actually pretty interesting. And I'm guessing we'll be going through many of those maybe in the future. So that's one idea for that discussion.
So, yeah, just to sort of try to tie in a couple of the different rounds of questions. So I think there's a thread here of sort of remedy, enforcement, and I think going back to the important point of, you know, not necessarily looking to new legal and normative frameworks, but seeing what we already have in place. I think the question of enforcement is really key, and, you know, looking at the NCP system, for instance, how can that system be further strengthened as a channel when judicial remedy perhaps isn't feasible for rights holders themselves? I'm now thinking a little bit about different impacts, so thinking about automation, which we haven't really discussed yet, and the future of work, which disproportionately has the risk of impacting women and people of color. How are we doubling down on protection of the freedom of association and trade union rights? So that workers can speak up and power dynamics can be balanced in the workplace. But I think also something that encourages me is looking at the next generation of employees themselves and investors. So I'm thinking here of Google and their own employees pushing back against risks around the use of Dragonfly, and then that being echoed in the investor community, and a resolution next week is going to be voted on at the Alphabet AGM on this. So thinking creatively about how we can have these sort of inside-outside strategies within the investor community, the millennials and women that are due to inherit the bulk of the world's wealth are caring much more about these issues. So how can, again, not to beat the same drum, but going back to coordination across those who hold a lot of leverage and those who suffer the greatest impacts.
Yeah, just quickly on the question on impact assessments, I do think that kind of thing can be an important tool. When we talk about, say, a risk assessment process that would, say, the way we look at our development of AI technology, taking those principles, trying to assess what the risks are, the level of impact, the human impact, is there a human review that's going to be in place for a consequential decision? Is there a particular risk of harm to certain groups? I think that sort of assessment process is critical. The only thing I'd say is it's one tool among others that have to exist, and just mandating something like an algorithm impact assessment alone, and I don't think this is what was being suggested, but that kind of thing alone is only focused on one aspect of the input. And when we look at regulation, when we look at the kinds of standards that need to apply to companies and society more broadly, it really, I think at the end of the day, needs to focus on the outcomes. What sort of harm is likely to be generated? What sort of impact is there going to be on humans? And that's, you sort of work backwards from that. So they can be an important tool, but I wouldn't focus on that as an instrument exclusively.
Thank you. We can do one lightning round if you keep your comments to about a minute. Sir?
My name is Rajendra Acharya from UNI Global Union, which is the private services global trade union federation that represent the ICT industry as well. ICT, as you said, as the panelists already said, that it has been used for surveillance, tracking, and so much of privacy issues, especially for trade unions. When we start organizing, exercising freedom of association, or even we talk about collective bargaining and all these sort of things. So that is the big issue, how to cope up with that. That's the big question. I would welcome to have some suggestion from the panel there. Mainly these companies, like what somebody would say GAFA, the Google, Alibaba, Facebook, and the Apple. If you see these companies, the biggest of the biggest companies, what the panelists would think to crack those companies, because I think that they are the superpower companies in the world. and we are talking to the poor workers. If you talk about Alibaba, even they don't have chance to go to toilet, and they have to pee in the bottle. And if we are talking about Google, recently you have seen the gender issues there and the outcry. But this is in a very small scale. We need to have a bigger mobilization of that. But we are tied up with, because of the resources, because of the influence that they have, the trade unions simply cannot get into it, and we need a bigger solidarity and bigger use of this type of, what you have said is the remedy mechanism or whatever. This is what the biggest challenge that we have in this industry. At the same time, another dimension in ICT is the call center companies. Take example of Teleperformance alone. It's the biggest company in the world now. Even in America, AT&T, nearly 60,000 workers are from Teleperformance alone. They are in almost all countries. For big companies, they provide services. To Orange, they provide. To other companies, you can name list of the companies they have, the Teleperformance provide services. In Asia, they have a big operation in Philippines, the biggest in Philippines, if you take example of Asia. This company, we are ongoing with the challenge and organizing them. Some countries we have already succeeded. Philippines is in the plan, not yet. But it is again a very, very difficult company to deal with. Looking into the timing, I think moderator is already seems to be in a hurry. So I would, if you can just share some ideas that how we can use these tools, OECD guideline, MNE guideline, or UNGP. We've been trying our level best, but please, I would like to have from yours. Thank you.
Last very brief comments from the center.
Oh, thank you very much, sir. Dennis Liu from China Electronic Standardization Association. It's been an honor to have the last chance. First of all, I was attracted by different quotes relating to Chinese consequences. One very brief echo to Mr. Zagman on this social credibility thing. I think, in my personal opinion, being just a citizen, I think due to the traditional history on relatively less developed corporate governance, it has been difficult for banks to quickly establish a mechanism to do that. But overall, in our ordinary people opinion, just on my own opinion, this is not a bad way from the central government to collectively gather that. It's very quickly to generate efficiency, because there are many cheaters. So plot theory, I mean, when we gossip in the bar, I would do that. But for a solemn situation on United Nations, I would plea for solemnness. But then yes, CISA is an industry association under the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. MIIT, the ministry, has been recently starting to work on the research of artificial intelligence. We have been visiting, in May, visiting OECD in Paris and got this paper on this recommendation of Council on Artificial Intelligence, but it's very rough and general. We are still working on that. But on the other side, we are thinking that entrepreneurship and the business ethics would be one focal point to relate to the real situation, because for instance, the other giant company, Tencent, has recently changed their slogan that business for good, similar to do no evil from Google. But in reality, we still criticize them for creating games that making students indulged. And the central government is very much concerned on that. So there's a lot of things, especially they believe it's the businessmen themselves. They have to bear the business ethics. So and also on artificial intelligence, because the big data calculation on e-business, because we have so many giant e-business operators. So that is something very much related. And we are working on that. We are also trying to we have this toolbox project to try to invite brains and participants on that. So finally, all these things, because it's a little bit premature stage, I would like to conclude my result into a question to make it micro and soft. So Microsoft, Mr. Yes, maybe you could share some experience on how does Microsoft manage your game, and then especially in preventing the indulgence for young people. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions. I'm going to turn it back to the panel. I give each of you a minute or two to respond to the questions or to make any final remarks that you'd like to make. Marcus, you want to start?
Yeah, how do we stop people playing games? I'm not an Xbox player myself, and Xbox is a Microsoft company. To be honest, I'm going to have to get back to you. I think it's a very interesting question, but I'm not sure if that's what our specific measures have been on that. If I can pick up on something else you said, though, very quickly, which is you mentioned the OECD, and it just reminded me that I think there's a note of pessimism about how long it takes global processes to develop on some of the norm setting on issues like AI. And it's quite striking that in the last 12 months, an OECD multi-stakeholder group, the European Union, Singapore, Japan has issued some draft principles. There's Beijing AI principles that a group of academics and think tanks have issued recently. There is actually a lot happening on this front. So I think just to close on that note that we perhaps shouldn't be too pessimistic about the sort of energy in the global conversation on setting norms and principles on some of these things. There's clearly a long way to go. We shouldn't be declaring victory anytime soon, but there is a lot of momentum and interest, and communities like this can have a really important role in driving that conversation forwards.
Well, I have a comment on your question actually in terms of gaming. And we're doing, I think you may, I don't think you talk about Xbox, I think you talk about esports and online gaming for young people. And we've actually started a big project on this because we've realized that a lot of students do this across the region, not just in China. And it's not something that you can't stop. I don't think it's something that can be stopped, but it's about something to turn into something that you can maybe not even control, but that you can maybe guide to something positive. And a lot of research could be done on this, the research could then support other areas such as health and well-being that are really important. So I don't think it's about stopping it. I think it's about turning it to something positive. And for that, you need to understand it better and also understand where it comes from and why students are doing this, and make it a different environment, not just male-orientated, but widen the interest in this and so on and so on. So I think that's something to look at. And final comment, in general, I think this is a cross-border question. Like many of these things that we talked about today, it's not just about industry, it's about government, it's about, and also not just about academics or universities, it's something that needs to be done together.
Yeah, I actually think that's the case of Tencent right now with gaming regulation in China is absolutely fascinating. So I host a podcast that looks into publicly listed Chinese companies and kind of goes through their earnings reports. And Tencent's been very frustrating from an investor's perspective because they have these game kind of delays and then starts and then delays and then starts with their approvals from the regulatory body. But from a social perspective, I think it's been very, very fascinating to see kind of how Beijing is trying to look at gaming and trying to work with Tencent in this regard because it is an epidemic. Not just in China, but elsewhere. Gaming is too good. Like, games are too good. I personally have a Nintendo Switch that I enjoy very much. But it's something that also for children, right? They don't have that sense of kind of self-control, right? Where I can say, okay, it's 1 hour for me today, and then I got to do more work or something like that. But with children, it's an entirely different thing. And I think that the comparison with drug use and abuse has been used, and I don't think it's entirely off base to use it that way. So my question would be, I think that it is important to have some kind of some kind of framework about kind of what they can and cannot do, or how far is too far. That's always my question with a lot of Chinese regulatory stuff is, how far is too far? But I do think that it's a very, very interesting case. My other question with Tencent would be, okay, what is good and also what is bad, and how do you determine that, and what's too bad? But I do think it's a really fascinating area where there is some innovation going on, and I'm watching it with a lot of interest.
Jeremy?
As a father of an 11-year-old boy with a Switch, the fact that there's a parental control that allows you to set how much time is used, I think is a wonderful thing, and shout out to Netflix, please include the same thing. I think this discussion is really interesting, actually, and some of this thing comes back to intentionality, right? What are we really talking about here? Are we talking about the intentionality of understanding kind of games and usage and behavior? Are we talking about the intentionality of control, right? And I think those are the big things. We at BSR work in the space of business and the intentionality of the games and the intentions and those kinds of questions, not in the political realm, right? And so I think the political realm can be scary, right? And what happens in the future, and that is why like national governments, the United Nations, this kind of discussion is absolutely fundamentally interesting. And then I would add the bit to that, which I think has been a key antiseptic in a lot of the responsible business work is, sunlight is an antiseptic, right? So transparency enables some degree of accountability. How do we think about that? How do we think about that within an AI structure and governance and oversight? I think it's actually something else we haven't really talked about yet, but it's fundamentally important. So I'll leave it on that.
Sarah, you have the last word from the panel.
Ooh. Okay, so I won't say anything on gaming. I actually wanted to reference the other question from our colleague at uni, trade union. So I think this is a really critical piece, and I sort of already mentioned this earlier, but really doubling down on recognition of freedom of association, the whole plethora of trade union rights as the tried and true, originally worker voice mechanism. Talking about tech, there's so many different new tech ideas, innovations in our space to, and I really hate this word, capture worker voice to drive responsible business conduct. While I think there is interesting innovation that can be explored, this should not sort of come at the expense of recognition of worker empowerment, worker-driven social responsibility, and because workers and impacted people are the #1 voices that should drive innovation in this area. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Sarah. We're out of time. I'll refrain from trying to summarize the entire session, but to say that I suggest to the organizers, perhaps next year we can devote an entire day to this topic and everything that flows from it. I mean, I think you could make this the theme of the entire conference one year. And it just strikes me that going back to the questions we began with, the answers are going to really depend on a number of factors. They're going to depend on whether we're thinking about the immediate current context, the near future, the far future, what we mean by norms, what we mean by normative. Are we talking about legal frameworks, ethical regulatory codes? And the technologies themselves, we've treated them almost as one thing, but these are enormously diverse and very different forms of technology. Some appear to be extensions of existing technologies that we understand. Others may be more game-changing. They may change the way we accrue knowledge, the way we think of ourselves, the way we think of our rights and how they should and must be protected. So I suggest we stay close to the framework that we have, the UDHR, and all of the hard and soft law that's come from it. But obviously there's a conversation to be had and an exciting future to look forward to with lots of positive and negative implications. So I'd just like to thank all of the guests for being here, the organizers, and I hope we'll be able to reconvene and continue this conversation at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick, and thank you all the speakers. We have now a short coffee break. Please be back in 15 minutes for the last session of the day.